Right. This is Parsha's Toldos. There will not be a share for the next 2 weeks. I shall post Bli Neder the shiurim from previous years, so it shouldn't leave you completely bereft. So this week's shir has been titled "How to Defend Against Anti Semitism," which will become very apparent from the Sedra. Indeed, it might be a slightly different take to what is popular out there, but I'm all for feedback. The shir has been dedicated Le'elu Nishmas Avram ben Eliezer, Miriam bas Shlem Zalman Ephraim, Lishois L'chol Tzedzoihem, Ubefrat Chavabela bas Rus Avram b'Chavabela, Tina bas Chavabela, Pascha bas Yehudis Itka, Meir ben Chan Rochel Tzipurcha bas Yehudis Itka. Parshas Toldos is one of my favorite parashas. It depicts a story between two individuals of Yaakov and Esav, essentially setting in motion and giving us a grounding and understanding of an age-old hatred that existed between Yaakov and Esav, as is apparent from this week's Sedra, and that continues until today between Klal Yisrael and Esav's descendants. With this parasha, we have an opportunity to once and for all understand what lies at the core of anti-Semitism. What is it about us that they hate so much? And what do we have in our arsenal that we can do about it? And for what purpose is there such a hatred? So let's begin by establishing some straightforward facts about Yaakov and Esav. We know, if you had to define or explain who Yaakov Avinu was, we know that Yaakov represented emes. Each of the three Avos represented a different midah. Yaakov was emes, as the pasuk in Micha says, Titein emes liYaakov, truth. Yaakov was a man of truth. The Netziv writes in Hamikdova on the pasuk Chofei Chav Zayin, Yaakov ish tom Yoshev Holim. Yaakov is described as an ish tom. What does it mean, tom? You know, in the Haggadah, when we use the word tom, it's slightly condescending. We're sort of saying, simpleton, right? Clearly, we're not trying to call Yaakov Avinu some sort of simpleton. So the Hamikdova and the Tziv says, it means, Mutmam imanoshim mashe bepiv kach beliboy. Yaakov Avinu was someone who lived in a congruent way. He lived authentically. That which he said is what he felt. That which he felt is what he said. There was no shady, two-faced, funny business with Yaakov Avinu. He was totally, authentically himself. And that was his midah of emes. That's what emes means, living with emes. Being yourself, wholeheartedly, wholesomely. And we also know that Yaakov's strength was his learning of Torah. Right? Same pasuk, Yaakov ish tom, Yoshev Oholim. Yaakov sat in the tents. What tents? Tents of Torah. Yaakov learned Torah. He learned Hashem ve'eva. Famously, Yaakov Avinu learned for 14 years without properly sleeping, etc. What is Torah? Torah is emes. The chilam of Torah is emes. Torah is emes. Yaakov Avinu is emes. There you have the synchronized midah. Yaakov Avinu is emes. All right. On the other hand, Esav was the exact opposite of Yaakov. He spent his days deceiving, pretending, living a life of sheker. He would put across to other people what a tzaddik he was, when he, at the same time, was getting up to the most heinous acts. So much so, he was putting on such a good show that when they were growing up, the pasuk tells us, "Vayigdulu hanaorim," they grew up. Says Rashi, "Kozman she'ktanim lo hoyu nikorim b'ma'asehim." When they were children, they weren't even recognized for their differences. What does that tell you? It tells you that the way Esav conducted himself was exactly the same in appearance as Yaakov conducted himself. And it was only when he became of age that he started doing other things, and he went off to the field. But until that point, they looked the same. And Rashi tells us, what does it mean that Esav was ish yegdei atzayid, which literally means you knew how to hunt. Says Rashi, lotzo de he says oviv bepiv. What he knew how to do really well was deceive his father with his mouth. Esav knew how to deceive his saintly father Yitzchak. And Rashi tells us from Chazal, he would pose all sorts of fanciful questions. How do you take Maisa from salt and all the rest of it? And Yitzchak thought, wow, this kid's going places. Wow, Esav is such a medaktik b'mitzvahs. That was the impression he gave off. The one aspect of Esav that stands to his credit is Esav's kibbud av. He respected his father, and it doesn't seem to have been just a spiel. There seems to have been a genuine respect that he had for his father Yitzchak. And the Bereshis Rabbah Medrash tells us a very astonishing statement by Reb Shimon Gamliel. He says, Kol yomai hayisi meshamesh Abba. All my days I served my father. V'lo shimashti echad mimeya sheshimesh Esav es Aviv. And I didn't get to 100th of the covered that Esav served his father with. And the Medrash goes on to say, Esav would don bigdei malchus to serve his father. This is a whole different level of respect that Esav had to his father. The Medrash does not engage in hyperbole. If the Medrash says, if Rav Shimon Gamliel says he didn't get to 100th of Esav, maybe he was exaggerating a bit to make the point, but he clearly identified a madrega of kibbut av that Esav had, which was way above the norm, and that was to Esav's credit. I saw brought down from the Zohar Parsha Vayera that says Mefurish that it's Esav's kibbut av from Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, Esav's kibbut av that enabled him to rule the world for so long. Esav's kibbut av is the one thing that stood to his merit and was a merit. But that was just his kibbut av. It did not reflect on any other part of his conduct. Interestingly, Rav Yitzchak Isaac Sher has a very strong and particular take on Esav. And he understands that in the same way that Esav conducted himself with piety with regards to kibbut av, Esav likewise acted with piety across all other areas of conduct. But note the word acted with piety. In other words, kibbut av was the genuine output of Esav. But that doesn't mean to say it stood on its own, that somehow he was astonishing at kibbut av. Esav, the way he conducted himself, he was pious all the time. He was Mr. Frum. But the part of kibbut av was a genuine output of piety. He says it before in Lekhet Zichas Musa. He says, after we've seen what Esav did when he was kibbut av va'im, yesh lanu lahakish eleho sha'ar asakov v'maisav. We can compare that to the rest of his behavior. Ki Esav misnaheg ka'adam godol medaktik b'mitzvos kalog k'bachamura. Rav Yitzchak Isaac Sher says that Esav, in his conduct, he behaved like a great person who would be particular with every mitzvah, even that which is considered lenient, a little bit light. They would take it seriously. K'bachamura. I once heard from the neighbor of Shalom Shvadron, if you imagine, all the Sedra pictures the kids come home with, when it shows Esav, this great big, scallywag, he was a Stramel Becket Yid with a Langer bod. He wasn't someone to be sniffed at. He was someone who walked around pious. But it was all a deceit. It was all a show. And Rav Yitzchak Isaac Sher tells us that the Torah points us to the moment of weakness where Esav showed his true colors. Esav comes home in the beginning of the Sedra after a long and tiring day, and Chazal tell us that he was doing all sorts of averos on that day, but he was tired out. And he comes into the house and he sees Yaakov cooking a soup. And what does Esav say? Haliteini no min odom odom azeh. Pour me from this red soup. He wanted Yaakov to put it straight in his mouth. He was talking in such a vulgar fashion. Says Rav Yitzchak Isaac Sher, the Torah alights on this. And the Torah says, Al kain karashmo Edom. Oh, that's why he's called Edom. One incident, asking for a bit of soup. Torah says, that's why he's called Edom. Says Rav Yitzchak Isaac Sher, what the Torah is showing us is this was a moment of weakness. That really Esav, for the rest of the time, spoke in a different way. He conducted himself in a, so to speak, more pious way. Looked like he was more refined. He got up to whatnot behind the scenes. But in front and center in his conduct, he looked like the pious man. It was therefore unbecoming for him to suddenly come out with his Haliteini Namid Adam Adam Azeh. Says the Torah, oh, that's the real Esav. You've just lost your cover for the moment. We've just seen the real authentic Esav come through. Al Kain Koroshmoy Edom. That's who you really are. Says Rav Yitzchak Isaac Sher, the Torah is telling us that in a moment of weakness, Esav lost his facade, he lost his pretense. And the real Esav came through. He further quotes from a Pasuk in Mishlei. Pasuk in Mishlei Chavav Chav Gimel says, Kesef sigim metzupa al chores. Like silver laid over earthenware. Continues, person's mouth is pretending to be something else than his heart. And Rav Yisrael Asher quotes from the Yalkut Shimoni, which says that this pasuk in Mishlei HaKosov Medaber be'Esav. This pasuk is describing Esav. And what is he compared to? He's compared to this kli that has mibachutz shel zav margolios kavois boy. It's a golden plated vessel with lots of jewelry on it. It looks very fine and lovely. Elosha mibifnim hoyoshal cheres kach Esav. The insides of clay. Says the Yalkut, that's Esav. Esav put on a really good show. Deceived everybody. People thought, psh, Esav. But deep down, Rav Yisrael Isaac Sher says that Esav was under the illusion that he could be the continuation of the chain that began with Avram Avinu. That you could have Avram, Yitzchak, Esav. He was in illusions of grandeur about himself. That's how far his pretense went. That's how far his game went of how holy and pious he claimed to himself to be. But as we said, in that moment, the Torah tells us his own mouth, his vulgar speech gave away the game. That in the moment of tiredness, the moment of weakness, his real character came through. But that was just a glimmer. The rest of the time, he covered it up. Pasuk in Malachi, there's two psukim. Haloi ach Esav liYaakov, Malachi Aleph Beis. Esav was the brother of Yaakov, and the next pasuk it says, "There's Esav son Esi. Yaakov I loved, and Esav I hated." So Yisrael says, "What's the pasuk trying to? Just telling us some facts about our history. Esav was Yaakov's brother. What's being said over here?" So Yisrael says, "Tracking this pasuk is same idea that was saying. Yaakov and Esav were brothers. In other words, they appeared, for all intents and purposes, to be similar or the same. But it says Hashem, who's able to see deep inside a person. Hashem is able to discern the difference between a person's pneumius, when a person is living with emes, or the person is living with sheker. Hashem says, no, Yaakov Avinu I love, Esav I hate. But only Hashem was able to make that difference, that differentiation. Because to the public Joe, Esav and Yaakov were brothers, they looked, whatever, same, similar. It's remarkable because we're so used to learning about and understanding the wickedness of Esav and all that he got up to. It's astonishing for us to picture, to imagine in our mind a completely different character, at least in the way he appeared.
He was red.
All right, there's red people. I mean, you've got red beard. Yeah.
No, but...
You mean to say in physicality he was different?
Yeah.
Okay, maybe. But I think the point that we're trying to point to is not so much in physical appearance they look the same, in conduct. They just look like two good Jews, two good people. Yeah. No, seriously, there's a Shon somewhere who says, you think Esav walked around with a big beard, a big stram, a big bekecha, he was a Chodem Choshuv, and people, Yisrael says he behaved like an Odom Godel. It's an interesting term. Yeah, it doesn't just mean like a Choshuv Balabos. This guy was a Choshuv Yid. He was like a big guy. He was, he was handling, learning with his father. You can picture it already, man. I can see you picture it already.
He never came from the field. He didn't come from the field.
Yeah, true. These guys has a whole Torah about everything that Esav did. He justified it all. It was all justified, and he killed Nimrod, and he killed this, and he brings from Chazal how you could pretend so much that you end up doing things like killing and all the rest of it, and thinking you'd mamish Yeah, okay, but don't forget in those days anyway they would do more physical. I mean, they would be out there hunting and whatever. Like that would be a thing. David HaMelech killed people. I mean, he was fighting in wars. Yeah. I mean, we're not going to cover in this shir how it worked with Yitzchak Avinu. In previous years, we've spoken about it, how Yitzchak interacted with Esav and how that makes sense. But one thing is clear: Yitzchak Isaac Sheh certainly learns that Esav pulled the wool over Yitzchak's eyes. That Yitzchak fell for it hook, line, and sinker. He thought Esav was genuinely a good, righteous, pious person, and it makes you really crystallize this idea of the falsehood of Esav, because we're trying to depict this scene of Esav coming across as a holy Jew, a holy person. If Yitzchak Avinu is able to fall for it, you've got to understand how good this show was. Yeah.
To put fear in his arms and he can
That was
get
Yaakov,
it.
right? But that was a physical deception of Yaakov. Yeah. But we're saying now with Esav in his conduct, he pretended so well to be such a pious person that his father fell for it. His father, the Yitzchak. Okay, so we're quite clear. The difference that we know of, being able to study Yaakov and Esav now in hindsight through Chazal, we're able to understand the huge difference between them. Yaakov is Ish Emes, Esav Ish Sheker. What about the hatred? What's that all about? So the famous Chazal, it's a Sifri brought by Rashi in Parsha Vayishlach. When Esav met Yaakov then, Esav comes running to Yaakov, and the Pasuk tells us he came towards him, Vayishokehu, and he kissed him. And on top of the word Vayishokehu, there are dots. And Rashi tells us there's one of the reasons there are dots from the Sifri, Amar Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, Halacha hi biyodua she'Esav seina liYaakov. It's a halacha that Esav hates Yaakov. That's what was so unique in that moment, that his mercy overwhelmed his hatred, and he kissed Yaakov b'chol liboy, the Sifri tells us. So that's shot in the pasuk there. But the point I want to bring out over here is very, very interesting lashon halachi. It's an undisputable fact. Esav hates Yaakov. Now, what's clear to me, and we're going to elaborate a little bit on this, what's clear to me is this hatred is not only because of the brachas. There are, I believe, Mefarshim, it could be there's a view out there that explains the entirety of the hatred of Esav to Yaakov is all down to the fact that Yaakov stole the brachas from Esav. That's not, to me, it's apparent that the hatred is far deeper than that. In fact, there is a amazing Esav HaKabbalah who says, after Yaakov got the brachas instead of Esav, the Pasuk tells us, Vayistoim Esav es Yaakov. Esav hated Yaakov ala bracha. Right? Esav was very annoyed. Yaakov got the brachas instead of him. Says the Esav HaKabbalah, Be'emes, Rosha hazeh, lo haya choshesh klal al brichas aviv. This Rosha Esav did not care two hoots about the brachas that his father gave. And he wasn't expecting or hoping for any purpose, any gain from the bracha of his father. So what's all the crying about? A Yitzhak. Says Esav HaKabbalah, Esav's crying was a spiel to further convince his father, in line with all the deception up until then, that what a great guy he was. Because think about it, if Esav's the Adam Choshev, and his brachas get taken away from him, what do you think his reaction is going to be? Of course it's going to be, oh my gosh, what have we lost, right? So he was keeping him to character by descending into tears. It's definitely not the normal pshat, because actually it is said that later on Haman got koiches because of Esav's crying at that moment. That's the Gemara, etc. But at least from the building, the scenario that we've been building in Esav and his Sheker, Kabbalah reads right into it. Esav, complete spiel. Even being upset with the brachas. The brachas, in my opinion, is clear, was not the cause of hatred. Esav didn't even care. Rav Shimshon Hirsch says the word vayistom in the hatred is a lashon of sosum. It's blocking, suppressing, holding in. There's something very, very deep within Esav. Esav's covering up, holding on to, covering his true feelings of hatred to Yaakov. What is it? You know, the word halacha is an interesting choice of language. Halacha, Esav hates Yaakov, right? Normally, halacha is used to describe a Torah law, not just a factual description about Esav hating Yaakov. Why is the lashon halacha? So I came across an Igros Moshe. Moshe Feinstein writes, Choshe Mishpat Chelik Beis Siman Ayin Zayin. He's talking in a tshuva there, but essentially what he says is that you need to know that the Goyim hate the Yidden, even when the countries act positively towards the Jews. You have to know that there's hatred there. Tzarich leida shehasina liyisrael mikol ha'umos hi gedola gam mimalchus shenagim b'tova. That's the pshat he says in the lashon halacha Esav Yaakov. Halacha means this is true, this is fundamental, and this is here to stay. That's what halacha means. It's not just something shallow, something that comes and goes. It depends on lots of different factors. It doesn't depend on anything. With all the hasbara in the world, ultimately Esav Yaakov, which doesn't yet answer the question, why? which I'd like to do next. Why is it that this hatred is so there and apparent? I mean, it's clear. Esav's hatred is not, as I said, an emotional reaction to losing the Bukhara. There's an ideological hatred here. What is it? So I once heard a fantastic shir on the topic of anti-Semitism by Reb Shaul Rosenblatt, and he shared a very interesting insight, because he went through all different reasons in history why various people, why various nations, various wicked people have hated the Jews. And it's really remarkable. There are periods in history we've been hated because we were powerful. We've equally been hated because we were weak. We've been hated when we didn't have our own country, and we're hated when we have our own country. We were hated when we were rich. We were hated when we were poor. The Germans, no less than the Germans, Yimach Shemam, called the Jews the vermin. We were low class and we were hated. And yet in other societies and other periods of history, we were hated because we were all awesome and powerful. What is going on here? If any of these reasons were the cause, the core of anti-Semitism, then it would be applicable across. The fact that it's sometimes like this and sometimes like that tells you that it's just a cover. It's not the real reason. That's all a very interesting observation, which leads us to the main point here, that in Dvarim, the last battle before Moshe Rabbeinu's Ptira, Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu, Nakoim nikmas b'nei Yisrael me'isa midyonim. Right? Go smash up the Midyanim. Go fight against the Midyanim. When Moshe Rabbeinu repeats that instruction to Klal Yisrael, he says, that we should fight the fight of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Midyan. Now this is an interesting change of language, because Hashem said, Nakoim nikmas b'nei Yisrael, and Moshe Rabbeinu says, Nakoim nikmas, no, says nikmas Hashem. So Moshe Rabbeinu's changing, adding, what's he doing here? Rashi says a very simple and powerful statement. Nikmas Hashem, says Rashi, Sheha oimed keneged Yisrael Ki'ilu oimed keneged HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Someone who stands up against Klal Yisrael, it's as if they're standing up against Hashem himself. And this is the crux of the matter. A fight against Klal Yisrael is a fight against Hashem. You know why? Because who are Klal Yisrael? Who are we? Klal Yisrael are the ambassadors of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in this world. We're described as Mamleches Kohanim V'Goy Kodesh. We're the chosen nation. We represent HaKadosh Baruch Hu in this world. And another way of saying that is, we are the moral conscience of this world. And that's not an egotistical thing. It's not a personal thing. It's not lifting your nose in the air and saying, look how great I am. It's not about us as people. It's about us because of whom we represent. We represent HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We represent truth. When you see a Jew, what you're seeing is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You're seeing Torah. You're seeing truth. There are Goyim who claim to be part of the Judeo-Christian values. It's all fancy language. It's the Torah. The morals of the world that, at least, the highest moral and ethical standards of this world comes from the Torah. So, by the very existence of Klal Yisrael being representative of Hashem, we are reminding the world of the moral conscience. And that reminder is enough to drive them mad. I think it's amidst Torah. I really think it's the case. Anti-Semitism at the end of the day is because Goyim do not want to be reminded of Ribono Shel Olam. They'd rather not know about it. And for as long as we're around, there's a reminder of the Ribono Shel Olam right there.
You've got proof. Proof is all the ones that are coming out of the woodwork now. All the work have all lining up with Hamas against all the people who are progressive, people who are
moved wide away from moral.
Away from Hashem.
Yeah.
That's why they're supporting.
Yeah. The thing is that when we've had the Crusades and the Christians, even today, are right-wing Christians who also sort of are a bit anti-Semitic, they claim to be in line with God. So it's not always the case that their rhetoric is against Hashem, but against true moral code, it is.
Even if they're Christians, they're Christians when it's convenient.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's a moral thing rather than a God thing. They can claim lip service to God, but it's the moral fiber that the chosen people of HaKadosh Baruch Hu are there to remind the world of. So we understand the hatred. But then what's our response? What's the point of it? Why does Rabbi Shalom want the Goyim to hate the Yidden? And halacha, Esav and Yackov means is there as a constant. Chazal tell us on the Pasuk in this week's Sedra of Yitzchak's expression after Yaakov had come in, and Yitzchak was confused. You mentioned Yitzchak was confused. He had felt his arms were hairy. The voice was gentle like Yaakov. Koil Yaakov, the voices of Yaakov. Idami de Esav, but his arms are like Esav. What's going on here? It's the Medrash HaGodah tells us. Rabbi Yehuda Omer she'amar Yitzchak al Yaakov kishiyah hakoil kol Yaakov ein hayadayim de Esav. The Medrash tells us that in this pasuk, Yitzchak was communicating a message, whether he knew about it or not. But the Torah tells us at least this is the message that was within Yitzchak's words. That your antidote to Esav is koil Yaakov bizman kolzman koil Yaakov, or in the Beis HaMedrash with this Torah tefillah. Then the Esav have no shlita, have no chance over us. So if a person finds themselves in a world where anti-Semitism is increasing, Rahman al-Islam, don't take this as a message to take your placard out and stand on the street and say enough is enough. If you want to do it, b'vakasha, but that's not what it's about. What it's about is reminding ourselves of the moral conscience that we are here to represent. It is reminding ourselves of what is our counter to Esav, koil Yaakov. It's a reminder that we should take a greater appreciation in Baruch Elokeinu shebra'anu lichvoidoi v'hivdilanu min hatoyim v'nosan lanu teras emes. We should be proud to be Yidden, not so that other people should realize that we're proud to be Yidden. We don't really care that much about how it comes across to other people as much as we care about how it comes across to ourselves. We need to remind ourselves of the pride of being a Yid, of the pride of being ambassador of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of the spiritual food and energy that we draw from Torah Tefillah. Tzvi Koshelevsky takes this one step further, and I'm not going to say it over Hashav as he writes it, but he writes in Sefer Torah, he says it over in Torah Tzvi, the Lashon HaPosuk, Vayivez Esav es HaBechira. Esav despised. Yivez Lashon Bizoyon. He disgraced the Bechira. And he says this Lashon we find in Medrash Esther Rabbah, Haman, who obviously was Amalek, also used the Lashon of Vayivez. Because this Bizoyon, this disgracing of matters of Kedusha, started with Esav and goes down to Amalek, down to his descendants. But then he gets very sharp. And he reminds us of something that the Gaon writes in Evan Shleima, which I believe we have said over in Share before. That in the end of days, the Gaon writes, Amalek will have its representations within Klal Yisrael as well. And there are 5 things that Evan Shleima writes. 5 categories of people who are considered, so to speak, Amalek amongst us. Number 1, Ba'alei Machlekas Lashon Hara. People who are argumentative, out there to talk slander about other Yidden. Number 2, Ba'alei Taiva. People who are too consumed with the tithes of the world. Number 3, She'ein Toicham Kebarom. Now this is interesting, number 3, because this is what we've been talking about at the beginning of the shir. People who are not authentic. People who are coming across as one person and then hiding away their real self, which is really how we described Esav. Roitvim acha kovod, people who chase honor, and roitvim acha mammon, people who chase money. Now, the purpose of saying these categories, in my view, is not about looking around shul and deciding, there's category 1, there's category 2, because there's no point in that. There would be no point highlighting this stuff if all it leads a person to do is to look around at other people and go, okay, so they're Amalek. That's not the point. There's nothing to be gained from that. In my view, the purpose of reminding ourselves of what the Quran writes is for us to take a lesson from it and to look deep within and ask ourselves and self-critique, is there an Amalek within us that we need to work harder to fight against? We have to take an honest look at Amalek. And you want to know the key to fighting Amalek? If you're in passionate pursuit of truth, and I don't mean the modern day terminology of truth, my truth and your truth. I'm talking about objective truth. Truth that comes to you with wisdom, with insight, with genuine humility, with self-critique, or the real self-awareness, with as I say, you're passionately in pursuit of truth, you're in an entirely different place to Amalek. Amalek, it's all fakery, it's all deception, it's all messing about on the surface. If we want to take this lesson seriously, what I'm suggesting now from Ritzik Koshelevsky is there's a layer, there's a depth. Beyond the simplest response. The simplest response to anti-Semitism is to recognize that the Goyim and hating us are there to remind us of how we are different and what we are supposed to represent, and to encourage us to pursue further the Koil Yaakov of Torah Tefillah. But there's a depth further beyond that, to recognize that Amalek is represented, unfortunately, even amongst the Jewish people, in these 5 different midas. And it's on us to relentlessly pursue truth and honesty and humility so that we can make sure that we ourselves aren't any of those 5 categories to the best of our ability. And then in that zchus, Hashem will protect us from the hands of the Goyim, protect us that we'll be able to grow into wholesome spiritual beings, descendants of Yaakov Ish Emes. Shkoyach.